For regular in-depth defence news and analysis, visit www.defenceeye.co.uk. The Defence Eye podcast is brought to you by City Forum.
Hello and welcome to the latest Defence Eye update. This session we're going to look at the deployment to the Far East of HMS Prince of Wales and the UK-led carrier strike group. I have Francis Tusa, our colleague here, who's going to add some insights as to what it means for Britain and for the Far East and for the global naval situation to have a British-led carrier strike group in the Far East at the moment. Francis, what do you think?
Yeah, hi Tim. Well, it has been very much something that the carriers as a programme have always been linked very much with the Indo-Pacific region and then vice versa. It's almost been used as the justification. When you have said to the Navy over I think both of us have been covering this programme 20 years and sort of talked about, but what about the North Atlantic? And the Royal Navy has always been, no, it's Indo-Pacific tilt. This is what it's all about. So, that is why they're going east. I should make some mention of the fact that their, I won't call it sister ship, cousin ship, the French Navy's Charles de Gaulle, she actually finished a 5-and-a-bit-month cruise, which set off in November last year. So to get 2 European carriers in the region in, under 12 months, that's pretty significant.
I mean, the Far East seems to be attracting aircraft carriers at a massive rate. And we've had the British one, we've had the French one. Before the French one, the Italian one went. The Japanese this month have received their first F-35Bs to go on their flat tops. The South Koreans are looking at doing the same thing with their amphibious ships, putting F-35B in it. And the Chinese are moving ahead with their production of their Fujin class carrier, which is going to sort of rival the American Nimitz class. So,
and if we look at the graphic of the aircraft carrier fleets, yes, we are seeing very significant growth in carrier fleets. Japan, you can argue whether some of the existing ones, though they can take a 5B, classify as aircraft carriers, but certainly the intent, the ambition of the Japanese Navy is to make sure its carriers are capable of operating at. Trying to estimate what the Chinese carrier fleet is going to end up at is difficult because they just seem to be popping them out at a rate of knots, and you never know. There could be a Chinese carrier fleet as large as that of the United States. You cannot rule it out. I saw a figure somewhere that in the past 5 years, Chinese shipyards, I think it's both defence, it's just defence, had produced more tonnage than all of the Western shipyards since World War II. So that's why I've erred on the side of caution for China, but you could see the red bar being up at the 11-12 mark. Why? Because they can, and then they can say, we're bigger than the US Navy.
There's also something about the Pacific theatre that makes aircraft carriers so dominant. I mean, going back to World War II, aircraft carriers were the dominant weapon system of that conflict. And the distances and the sheer ranges involved still make aircraft carriers very relevant in that theatre.
Absolutely. And you can also, without being flippant, say that an aircraft carrier moves. Whereas if you have got a runway on a small atoll, it is fixed and it is far more easier to engage. Though, one of the issues about the Pacific theatre, if you look from the American point of view, specifically the US Marine Corps, originally the US Marine Corps were going to buy a majority of F-35Bs and some F-35Cs. Well, in their most recent budget and aviation plan, they've changed that round. They're deleting F-35Bs and instead buying the longer-ranged F-35Cs. And it is simply because the range. And the range of the C is substantially larger. There were concerns that if you were operating the B, you're actually having to get a bit too close to, and let's not beat around the bush, you're going to have to get too close to Chinese defence facilities.
And we're also seeing several other nations looking at boosting their aircraft carrier capability. India is building more. Turkey's looking at building the first ever purely drone carrier.
And interestingly, South Korea, which had plans for aircraft carriers, they then cancelled the carrier program, but they've gone back and are looking at turning that program into a drone carrier. And I suppose you can link this with the UK, because in the Strategic Defence Review, it's mentioned for the first time a key ambition for UK naval aviation is to have this, what was the exact word, a composite air wing, not just a fixed wing, but also long-range effectors. I hate that word, meaning drones, but also UAVs, returnable and redeployable UAVs. So this, I suspect, is going to be a major trend of the next decade.
The jargon phrase was hybrid air wing. I think that's what they used it in the SDSR. But it also allows nations that don't have a tradition of manned naval aviation, don't have a tradition of flat top aircraft carriers with fighter jets and bombers launched by catapults, to get into the game of aviation from sea. And you have, Turkey's never had an aircraft carrier. Their ambitions here are quite large, and you can see how other nations in a similar situation could join that game.
I think you cannot rule out countries such as Malaysia, Indonesia, especially out in Asia themselves, looking at this. I would then want to be keeping an eye on what Australia does with her LHDs, whether the Australian Navy and other Australian services look to see whether they can change them from being just helicopter carriers to something a little bit more punchy. I don't think we should forget, though, that Brazil has still got ambitions for aircraft, in inverted commas, conventional aircraft carriers. So, yes, the drone carrier, however you want to call it, is an obvious, good, cheap entry point. I still think you'll find a number of navies saying the ambition is always going to be full fixed wing, because that's the manly option.
In Britain's aircraft carriers, 65,000 tons, Prince of Wales and Queen Elizabeth. I mean, they're routinely lambasted for being too big, too vulnerable. But size brings something to the game. It's a quality all of itself. And it allows innovation, it allows modification, it allows upgrades to be done actually cheaper than if it was a smaller ship.
Very much so, and everyone would say, beloved though they were, the Invincible class, were probably half the size they should have been. And yes, I remember, sadly, of age, the big criticisms of the Type 42 anti-air warfare destroyers is, again, they were too small, which meant upgrading them became considerably more expensive. If we go back to former First Sea Lord and then Chief of Defence Staff, Admiral Sir Mike Boyce, sadly not with us anymore, he quoted or created the phrase when describing why the Type 45s were the size they are: steel is cheap and air is free. And he made precisely the point of, it's fine having empty compartments on a ship, because suddenly when you think, I need more computer power, you've got a compartment you can put stuff into. I don't want to start the whole other carriers the right size. It's one of those arguments where you have proponents on both sides of the argument, and they will defend their opinions to the absolute limit. If you look at the fact that the French currently, Charles de Gaulle, 42,000 tons, the PNG, Nouvelle Génération, they're talking about 80, maybe 85,000. Bearing in mind they can easily operate 30 plus Rafale off the current platform, why would you want to have a carrier double size of your current one? They've worked out it makes sense.
HMS Prince of Wales is now in the Philippine Sea, cruising north to arrive in Japan next week. She's going to spend 2 weeks on defence engagement with Japanese politicians, industry, regional leaders. And then we expect her to sail south into the South China Sea for the ritual freedom of navigation exercise and the ritual showdown
Coming of the nose.
Chinese. Yes, and there's a certain predictability about it, which we could even see the Chinese sending out at least one of their aircraft carriers for a ritual showdown with the British carrier. I mean, which would be very photogenic, but it would just make the points we've been making about how aircraft carriers have utility in that theatre.
Very much so. There has been a certain amount of Chinese Twitter, X, calling into question how good the Royal Navy's carrier task force is, and how much smaller it is than the equivalent People's Liberation Army Navy equipment. If there is going to be as you say, ritual meeting of two aircraft carriers, I would expect the Chinese one to have their deck as full of aircraft as it possibly can, simply to go, look what we can do. Is this point scoring? Is it childish? Yes. Is it seemingly inevitable? Yes.
I mean, it's also quite interesting to see how British politicians who only a year ago were talking about NATO first, NATO only, focus on Europe as the core of British defence policy, suddenly like flying first class to Australia and Japan and standing on our aircraft carrier. They seem to have become converts to the diplomatic power of 65,000-ton aircraft carriers.
Absolutely, and wouldn't you want, even at this time of year, to go to Australia to enjoy everything it has to offer and then max out on sushi in Japan? I think we need to inject a little bit of reality into this. If you read the defence white papers of Australia, South Korea, Singapore, Japan, they make no assumptions about their defence relying on the UK. None at all. In a lot of those documents, the UK doesn't even get a mention. Yes, it does send a slight signal about UK and UK intentions, but the reality is the 11 super carriers of the US Navy are the sort of things which Japan and South Korea will be looking to and at.
It's also noticeable that this carrier strike group is described as British-led. It's not a British strike group. I mean, the well-known issues with availability of frigates, destroyers, and attack submarines have impacted on what support ships the Royal Navy can actually send to the Far East.
Very much. And if you look back at the 2020 National Audit Office report called Carrier Strike Preparing for Deployment, it notes deploying Carrier Strike will require a significant proportion of the Navy's fleet, requiring it to maintain the availability of destroyers and frigates. And it is Navy Command is assessing how to address funding shortfalls across the Type 31, 26 and Fleet Solid support ship programs. And if we could just flash up the slide of the composition of the Carrier Strike Group 21 mission. To be noted that, which also went east of Suez, you had HMS Queen Elizabeth, lead ship. You had 2 Type 45s, 2 Type 23s. You had a Fleet Solid support ship, and then you had a US Navy DDG 51, the Sullivans, and then a Norwegian frigate. So at the time, it was sort of a given that a carrier strike, and I know people say, well, it depends on the mission, but the principle of, should we call it a sovereign carrier strike capability, was the carrier, 2 Type 45s, 2 frigates, a nuclear submarine, a tanker, and a Fleet Solid support. We are looking at a pretty pared down version, and what we are seeing, sadly, is the pretty pathetic state of the Royal Navy escort fleet. Type 23s falling off a cliff left, right, and centre, and a seeming inability to generate Type 45s still.
I mean, the finale of the deployment is going to be the return of Prince of Wales through the Red Sea. Now, the Red Sea is a very hot crisis zone at the moment with the Houthis, with their campaign against merchant shipping and international warships in the Red Sea. When Prince of Wales went through there in May, it passed without incident, but the situation in November could be very different, and we may even see British naval air power in action again for the first time since the Falklands War, in a real shooting war. So the odyssey of HMS Prince of Wales is not over yet.
Very much so. There are months to go until that happens, and bearing in mind the situation in the Middle East, I think it would be a very foolish person who would say, don't worry, it'll all be peaceful. Again, to make a comparison, which I think is valid, when the Charles de Gaulle went through the Red Sea, and it was very much a time of tensions, if not outright shooting war, the task group was augmented by a second air defence ship. And so they had the French Horizon, equivalent to Type 45, an air defence FREM, multi-mission frigate, and then a standard FREM. Question mark, 1 T-45, if there's a shooting war going on, wouldn't you want 2?
And we'll keep our viewers and listeners up to date on these developments in future editions of the Defence Eye podcast.